Hello, I'm Richard Sever from Cold Spring Harbor Lab and BioArchive. With me I have Ruslan Medzhitov from Yale. Ruslan, welcome back to Cold Spring Harbor.
Thank you. Thank you
You've
for
been here many
having me.
times, and I think we've sat in exactly this position before and talked, so I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, me too.
I'm really interested to talk with you today because I looked at the abstract for what you're going to be talking about, I think, tomorrow morning, and it was fascinating. You talked about an overarching view of the neuroimmune system connections, and it always struck me that when I talk with molecular biologists, so many of them say that they're terrified of immunology, and the ones who aren't terrified of immunology are terrified of neuroscience.
That's right.
So the idea of an overarching concept, I think, will really scare them. So I'm very interested to hear about it. But there are obviously examples. You point to the fact there are examples of interactions, but no overarching concept. So can we talk about some of those examples? I mean, I think of like inflammation and histamine and things like that. But what are the examples where we know there are connections between the two systems?
Well, examples so far, in some ways, these are can be. I mean, they're very illustrative, very informative examples, starting with Kevin Tracy's work on vagal reflex. Then there's been known for a while that mast cell products like histamine can act on each neurons. And of course, even longer history is of the effect of inflammation on hypothalamus and homeostatic set points. This is what happens during acute illness. So-called flu symptoms. It's when there's a high level of inflammatory cytokines in the circulation. They act on hypothalamic circuits that are responsible for establishing various homeostatic set points in the body, like body temperature, the appetite, sleep cycles, and so forth. And these are altered in a very prescribed, precise way. For example, set point for body temperature goes up, so we feel chills because body thinks it's cold. And then we raise the temperature to whatever degrees is deemed appropriate by these circuits. These types of interactions have been known for a while. Then of course, from there is also a relation between pain, inflammatory pain, and inflammatory which is basically, upon tissue damage, release of various inflammatory signals, then acts on nociceptors and causes pain. And pain is one of the cardinal signs of inflammation. So there's these types of sort of foundational examples that's been known for some time now. And now with new methods and techniques, of course, there's a lot more that can be done, and the picture is becoming more granular. There are interactions between neurons and, for example, lymphocytes or dendritic cells, macrophages, and they go in both directions. And that's where I see that in the next 5 years we'll see a proliferation of these kinds of examples. Some of them may kind of fit together into some sort of picture, hopefully. Others would be just fascinating examples, and the question would be why it works this way and why this system affects that system in a particular way. And that's where I think we may face this situation where there would be lots of examples, and maybe, depending on how science will go, maybe it will be limited by kind of a framework for understanding it. And although I put this in my abstract, I'm a little apprehensive about giving this kind of a talk. People generally don't like being lectured. They want to like show the data and move on. So I don't know how it will go and whether I will even do it. But what I'm thinking is that one fundamental issue is not just related to the topic of the symposium. Fundamental issue is that if you look at different areas of biology, some of them, like genetics, biochemistry, biophysics, evolutionary theory, they're kind of built from first principles. These fields sort of, it's always clear what they stand on. They stand on some fundamental principles, some derived from, for example, from physics and chemistry, In other cases, on fundamental theories, cellular theories, another example. So these are from first principles. Then you move into softer fields, and that's where I'm going to get in trouble, I think, with some people. The softer fields would be immunology, neurobiology, and developmental biology, and most of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean softer field in a disparaging way, but these fields are not necessarily built from first principles. Rather, the knowledge being kind of for historical reasons and for reasons of what's feasible at the time, they kind of build ad hoc, like we found one thing and saying, okay, this is how it works. But then something more fundamental, maybe it takes another 15 years to discover, then everything has to be rebuilt. And what I think is missing, and the reason, as you mentioned, that neuroscientists terrified from immunology, immunology terrified of neuroscience, what they're terrified of, not of the beautiful, simple principles that underlie this biology, but rather of the very specialized terminologies that are used in both fields, in neuroanatomy in one case and all these cell markers in the other case. And it's importantly, it's usually impossible to go from whatever some term is in either field and to say, well, what does it mean? If it's such and such marker, what does it mean to somebody who's not in the field? Or if it's that area, that particular nuclei in the brain, what does it mean? Is it the fact that it's activated, is it telling us something interesting, or is it surprising, or is it trivial?
Yeah.
And the answer usually would be, well, that's how it works, or it's more complicated than that, and so forth.
So you mean kind of like if I say, sort of T helper Th2 cells to a neuroscientist, like what does that mean? And an immunologist will have trouble. Meanwhile, a neuroscientist will say, well, we think this is what the hypothalamus does, but it's kind of our best guess now. Yeah,
hypothalamus would be actually probably one of a few examples where we can say in general what it does. But basically the issue is that we don't have, and then this is my opinion, and of course I think most people will disagree with me on that. In my opinion, that these fields need to be periodically, continuously, it's not a final process, but periodically reevaluated and thought of from first principles. So first principles, nobody will disagree that it's good to know something from first principles. What people disagree on, what do you call first principles?
Right.
If you talk to developmental biologists and say that, well, we don't understand development from first principles, they say, no, of course we do. We know how hedgehog signals, we know how wind signals, we know which cell types differentiate each in this way. These are not first principles, these are examples of how the system operates. And often, thinking from first principle requires a certain level of abstraction and very deliberately dealing with every assumption that is built into our language. Whenever we talk about the right papers, there was always some hidden assumptions that are not flagged as the assumption because everyone thinks that way.
Right.
And some things go from review to review, textbook to textbook, but then I think it's a very powerful way to find interesting new question is to read the first few sentences of introduction and to ask, well, how do we know that? Do we really know that? And often it would be a rabbit hole, and then in the end you say, well, some of it, of course, we'll know, and some of it will be just some assumptions. And so that's what I think we'll be also facing now when there is intersection of two fields. And the question will become, well, the two systems interact. Everyone is excited about this. It's a very exciting biology. Some of the examples that people, researchers uncovering, they're very surprising. So that's always good. So it means that we need to rethink certain things. But the questions, my favorite types of question is why something happens, like why it works this way, why this cell talks to this cell, and why the two systems need to interact to begin with. Is it surprising? Is it kind of expected? And so forth. And so I'm kind of willing to stick my neck out and to point out some of the things that that could be kind of a steps towards thinking about it from first principles. Usually it doesn't work well because, again, as I said, people don't want to be lectured, especially by an outsider to a particular field. Usually students respond better to that because they like.
But I don't think anybody would accuse you of being an outsider in immunology.
Not in immunology, maybe, but I mean, I've faced that in other fields when I try to make these points. But from the why perspective, why, for example, some neuron talks to some immune cell or vice versa, asking these sort of questions, and again, going back to what are the requirements to think from first principles, you need to use some level of formalism, some level of abstraction. And that's where I think there's a cultural problem in many fields of experimental biology, certainly not in more theoretical fields like population genetics or evolutionary theory and biophysics. They don't have that problem.
No, exactly.
That's kind of their language. But in the softer fields, abstraction is always sort of causing a logic reaction in people. They want some concrete details. And you need both types of science. You need science that goes into more and more details and covers surprising things, and you need also science that is more like trying to formalize it, to look at general principles and so on. And the latter part is lagging behind now in many fields because now everything is very data intense, technology driven. Any average lab can generate a lot more data than can be understood at some deeper level. And as a result, there is this explosion of data, which is great, but the theory is kind of lagging behind in many cases. And often it's not recognized that it's lagging behind.
Right.
So some level of abstraction and formalism, using formal language, is what's really important. And what it means is that you get away from specific details that are not essential. You get away certainly from all the terminology that is field specific and use terms that are more universal and general. Like, for example, the term sensor is a general sensor. It's sensor in biology, in engineering, it means the same thing. And then using this type of formal language with right level of abstraction, it kind of usually leads to a miracle in the sense that not only it leads to a better understanding, but it also opens up the connections to other fields where related problems are better understood.
Right.
Because once you translate into formal language, then you can see connections between the same kind of entities, same objects, principles, processes, and so on. Whether it's in engineering, in economics, in computation theory, or whatever it might be. And that's what I feel is currently kind of missing.
And do you think that will allow people to address kind of conceptual questions that have challenged the field, like, self, non-self? What does that actually mean in reality?
Yeah, exactly. It really is a tool to address conceptual questions and to frame them the right way. And there is a difference between a good theory and what I would call a pseudo-theory. Pseudo-theory is a product of increasing fragmentation of scientific enterprise. So in the field of immunology, when I was a postdoc, there was one Keystone meeting for all immunology. Now there are, I don't know how many, there's a couple dozen at least. And it's just fragmented within the field. The same goes with neuroscience, of course, and with any other field. As they get more and more fragmented in each sub field, they develop their own terminology, and that results in this insulation, so that you don't understand what the other one is talking about, even though they may be talking about the same principle. And that's the problem. And once one goes from these details to a more formal description, you move one step up, and then from one step up, and everything you study is a special case of something more general.
Yeah.
And in fields like physics and math and chemistry, the knowledge moves up from details to more general. In biology, it moves down generally, except for big theories like evolutionary theory. And this progressive moving down, leading to new terminology, new sort of more and more insulation, that's what leads to basically, if you're not a specialist and you go to a specialized meeting, you probably 90% you won't understand. Yeah. So that's the issue that that I think needs to be recognized and dealt with by kind of valuing the certain types of questions and certain level of formalism, and that's what I think will be needed.
So where do you start with that then? Beyond obviously giving a talk to a lot of people who are going to ask questions.
Yeah, I think in general it's not something. What I'm saying is not anything new. Like in many fields, again, that's how it works. You always start with like at the extreme, which is not applicable to biology, but the extreme example would be Euclidean geometry. So it's all built from axioms.
Right.
It has a set of axioms, and then everything else built from that. Axioms is something that nobody will question. Everyone agrees that that's true. What you call a point, a line, and so on. And from there, the entire field of Euclidean geometry was built. It's not, I don't think it's possible in biology, at least not yet, but you try to get as far as possible to that point, where you start with some unquestionable sort of truth, and then you avoid using any specific labels, specific terminology, because that's what sways you into thinking in a less general way.
Well, then you start assuming what you're trying to prove, right?
Yeah, and it just pushes you away from very general, big, simple questions.
Yeah.
And I think actually the one tool that is underutilized, instead of me saying how I would do it, I would put it this way: if there is a, let's say, field like this, let's say everyone agrees, we need to understand from sort of basic principles. Yeah. I think the best mechanism to do that is to have a few scientists, like people in this symposium, prepare like 5 minutes, very layman description of what they're doing. Maybe not in a appropriately simplified way, but whatever, as layman as they can get.
It's harder than people think.
And it is harder for sure. And then the audience should be like high school students interested, don't know anything about it, but interested in biology, and ask so-called naive questions. And answering these naive questions step by step, I think that's what will lead to the points, that we actually don't know, or that we don't understand. And then catching these sort of inconsistencies in our sort of mental models of how we approach any of these problems. That's what's valuable. That's why teaching is valuable. When you teach to students who are not sort of uninitiated in a given field, but smart, imaginative, and curious, that's the best, because they ask questions that you don't hear at symposia like this.
Yeah.
At symposia like this, they'll ask, did you do this control? Did you look at this? Did you look at that? Students will ask very basic questions that they catch some inconsistencies that we already became sort of desensitized to. Yeah. So that would be one mechanism to do it. But more generally, it's when you try to describe something to non-specialists who maybe, especially if somebody coming from exact fields like physics and math, you try to explain it to them. The first problem they will have when you start talking, they will ask to give a definition of whatever words you're using. Because in math, everything, you don't use a word unless you can define it precisely and rigorously. In biology, we kind of get a pass on that, and we just use the terms. If somebody don't understand, okay, you're not an expert. It's complicated.
Right. You don't know what a T cell is, so I'm not.
And if you force to define every term you use, most people will quickly run into a wall. They will have trouble defining it in a way that is understandable to non-specialists. And so you take anything, you take any aspect of immune system or nervous system, and you use some term, parabranchial nucleus. So what is that? Oh, it's a region connected to this and that. Oh, but what is that? Why is they connected? Oh, it's just the way it is. And boom, it's like, that's not a definition, right? So this is kind of it's an exercise. It can be very annoying and frustrating to people when they have to define it that way. But I think that's a very powerful mechanism to do that. To try to explain it to somebody who is used to thinking from first principles, like mathematicians, physicists, who would not take anything without definition. You cannot use term because it's useless if you don't know what it means.
What it means, right.
And in biology, of course, we have lots of terms like that.
Well, it's a fascinating a journey that's going to be. I guess all I can say is good luck with the axioms. It's been very nice talking with you again, Ruslan.
Yeah, thank you.
I look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.